A fragile land is standing and a path shrouded in ambiguity. Cautious optimism is overshrouded by deep skepticism in the unfolding diplomatic standoff between Tehran and Washington. As the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding aims to halt military operations across all fronts, the US faces mounting accusations of failing to restrain Israeli violations in southern Lebanon. In response, Iran has warned that any breach of the commitments jeopardizes the entire framework, asserting its readiness to restrict access to the Strait of Hormuz once again, a move that could instantly paralyze global energy markets. As technical delegations from the US and Iran, mediated by Pakistan and Qatar, gather behind closed doors in Bergenstock, Switzerland, the global economy watches closely. Oil has already begun to flow, driving prices down from $126 a barrel to $75. But the resilience of this 60-day ceasefire remains highly volatile. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special edition with me, Karim Fazakri. And as you followed in the intro, to unpack the complexities of this fragile truce, the hypocrisy of the international system, and the shifting balance of global power, I am joined by a distinguished panel of experts. We have Dr. Yvonne Ridley, leader of Scotland's Workers' Party, former journalist and British author, joining us from Glasgow. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening.
Good evening to you too. And we're also joined by Ms. Negah Angha, a visiting fellow at King's College and former senior advisor to the U.S. State Department and White House National Security Council. She joins us from London. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. We're also honored to have Dr. James Kavanagh, geopolitical analyst and strategic affairs consultant. He joins us from New York. Hello there, sir, and thank you for agreeing to be with us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we also have the pleasure to have Mr. Mohammed, Sassi, geopolitical observer and financial analyst. He also joins us from New York. Hello there, Mohammed Sassi, and thank you for being with us.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Perfect. Let's start the debate with you from Glasgow, Dr. Ridley. The first article of the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding explicitly demands an end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. Yet, Israeli airstrikes continue unabated. So does this blatant violation, met with deafening silence from Washington and London, permanently bankrupt the West's claim to uphold international law and human rights?
Well, I think that we all knew that Israel would throw its toys out of the pram when it was shut out and excluded from the peace negotiations. As for international law, well, it's having a public breakdown. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding has, as you say, just been signed, but bombs are still falling on Lebanon. And Washington and London are saying absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Pakistan did all the hard lifting to mediate this deal. They spent months bringing the US and Iran to the table. And what is their reward? Total silence from the West while the agreement is torn up. It really has been a thankless task. The West uses international law only when it benefits them. And right now, their moral arguments are completely bankrupt.
Mm-hmm. So all these efforts can just, evaporate if the violations of Israel continues in Lebanon. Do you think it would seriously affect this Memorandum of Understanding?
Well, I think we all knew that this peace talk was doomed to fail right from the beginning because the Israelis will not pull out of Lebanon. They are continuing to kill people. And it even Trump said, I wish they wouldn't try and destroy an entire block of homes to get one person. But, you know, they are being silent at the moment. We are led to believe that America is the superpower, but at the moment, it has got severe problems with Israel. And here in Britain, the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has absolutely nothing to say about the disgraceful behaviour and continuing to break international law that is Israel. You know, they're already facing the International Criminal Court for the war crimes committed in Gaza. And yet some of their government ministers are saying we will turn Lebanon into Gaza. And still there is silence.
Well,
Deafening silence.
exactly, but we don't know what is the meaning of this silence. And here, let me move to Ms. Angha to London now. Ms. Angha, the Trump administration is presenting this memorandum of understanding as a victory, yet Washington is failing to enforce the core condition restraining Tel Aviv, that is. So from your experience within the State Department and the National Security Council, is the U.S. establishment fundamentally incapable of holding Israel accountable, even when America's own geopolitical and economic interests are severely threatened here?
You know, I would sort of say Washington isn't powerless with Israel. It does actually have a leverage. The issue is it has a choice to fully use it or not. And right now, the administration has chosen not to use it. It wants an off-ramp without, I think, opening a confrontation with Prime Minister Netanyahu over Lebanon. The U.S., I think, fundamentally, is not necessarily incapable of restraining Israel, but it's politically unwilling to spend that leverage when it's required. I think, when we think about what kind of leverage Washington has over Israel, think about military assistance, diplomatic cover, intelligence cooperation, and just general resupplying of their military assistance. Vice President Vance most recently reminded the critics that Trump has been and will be sort of the only powerful ally that Israel has left at this point, especially given the fact that the United States has been supporting the Israeli military. So I think, I would add, the constraint isn't so much the establishment per se, it's in the abstract, right? It's not one-dimensional sort of explanation about a single lobby, but it's just a combination of things that transpire. A lot of it is sort of the bipartisan habits and the congressional politics that sort of dictate quite a bit in terms of what leverage to use, how to use it with Israel.
But Ms. Angha, the deal explicitly actually calls for an immediate end to military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. However, it has triggered severe diplomatic meltdown in Israel, if you come to look at it. For example, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to withdraw Israeli forces from Lebanon, vowing to continue strikes until Hezbollah is actually completely eliminated. So what happens next, according to you? Do you think that this would seriously jeopardize the deal?
I do think the Lebanon sort of file will be a huge spoiler if it's not taken seriously. I think, again, Washington has tried very hard to keep a narrow bargain with Iran, really trying to focus a lot of it on stabilizing the Strait of Hormuz, really keeping it to the economic components, and trying to avoid any sort of form of showdown over Lebanon. But again, it is a serious component. I think the Iranians have been expressing this very clearly with their actions over the last few days, that Lebanon will be the sticking point for the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Let's move now to New York with Dr. Kavanagh. Dr. Kavanagh, the U.S. was forced to the negotiating table largely because of its unconditional support for Israel, which dragged it into an unwinnable regional war, according to a lot of analysts and experts. So, how are Beijing and Moscow here capitalizing on this American strategic blunder? And does this memorandum of understanding actually signal the definitive end of the U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, like some are speculating?
Well, China and Russia can sit back and watch, really. The United States is digging a hole for itself that it can't get out of. And it's demonstrating its increasing weakness relative to other powers in the world. Look, it was presumed by everybody in the world that if the United States could start a fight and could end the fight when it wanted, we're going to pick a fight with Iran, and when we want to end that fight, Iran would not dare refuse to end it when we wanted to end it. Who would do that? We're the superpower. And they found out that's not the case. They found out their military power cannot prevent the smart and strategic military strategy of Iran and the economic strategy, which is the Strait of Hormuz and the dependence of the world economy on the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran is a huge country. It's 90 million people. It's very carefully prepared for this. So it is definitely, as many people said when this started, this can only end to the detriment of the United States. It's going to reveal that the United States does not have the hegemonic power it once had, and it had for 30 years after the demise of the Soviet Union. That's not the case any longer. We're not partying like it's 1999, and everybody has to realize that, and the United States has to realize it, and it doesn't want to accept it. It still has a lot of power. It can cause a lot of damage, but Iran is not ready to surrender. The United States has not made it ready to surrender, and Russia and China are sitting back, and not just sitting back. They're helping Iran. They're providing material support, military support, intelligence support, I am sure. And they're learning from Iran and from the conflict the vulnerabilities of the United States that they can take advantage of. So this is an inflection point in the world order in terms of the hegemony of the United States. The United States is no longer the unilateral hegemon of the world or even of the Middle East. And that's extremely important because everybody in the Middle East was always looking to Washington to solve the problem, or to mediate the problem, or to be the ultimate arbiter. That's no longer the case. And that's a big, big change. And I don't know whether it's going to, the most important actor who's going to resist that is not Washington, but Israel. Israel wanted Washington to be the center of Middle East diplomacy and Middle East and the military and diplomatic order in the Middle East. And Israel does not want to see that go away. So again, the wild card here is Israel. What Israel will do, what the United States will do in relation to Israel. The American political regime, although the popular sentiment, the tide of popular sentiment is changing radically and quickly, and I'm very happy to see that, but the American political regime, do not kid yourself, is still absolutely unconditionally dedicated to the support of Israel and to guaranteeing that Israel will never lose a war.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Kavanagh, again, earlier I asked Ms. Angha about the willingness of the United States to stop Israel from sabotaging this deal. And she mentioned a lot of leverage that the United States has over Israel. But what about the other way around? Because since the United States is unwilling actually to put a stop to the mess in the Middle East caused by Israel, actually a lot of people are saying that Israel has a lot of leverage over United States when it comes to money and economy. They are the ones in charge in the United States. And also the Epstein file and the corruption files that this country has against Washington.
Well, in terms of the Epstein files, look, if Israel has some dirt on Donald Trump that's specific, I don't know. I mean, that could be the case. There could be blackmail involved here. But it is absolutely the case that the United States has the power and capability of restraining Israel. The Israeli generals themselves said during Gaza, every bomb, every rocket, every missile that we throw is from the United States. As J.D. Vance just said, 2/3 of the weapons used in that war were American weapons. So the United States can instantly prevent Israel from attacking Lebanon, from attacking Gaza, from attacking whomever by saying, if you attack, you will never get another bullet bomb, missile, or rocket from the United States, and you will never get another vote in the UN or diplomatic support from the United States. That's entirely possible in objective reality. But the political regime in the United States is captured by Zionism and through layers and layers, throughout layers and layers. People are committed to this. Nancy Pelosi said, if the Capitol burns down today, burns to the ground, I will still be standing here for Israel. And these are deeply held things for decades. And that's what we have to get past in the United States. And it may happen. Look at what one of the most important thing that J.D. Vance said, I think, in the last couple of days was, yeah, there are plenty of people in Israel, in the Israeli government, who want to turn Iran into another Libya, a failed state with 90 million people. Is that something that's good for the United States? No, it's not. And that's true. But the United States has to wake up to that fact that they are engaged. Israel has them thinking, and they have themselves thinking. They're in this war for some reason: democracy in Iran, nuclear weapons, blah, blah, blah. That's not what that's not what this war is about. This war is about Zionism. Israel knows that, and Iran knows that. And the United States can get nothing out of this but trouble, and is getting nothing out of it but trouble, but the American political regime is still absolutely committed to Zionism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Kavanagh. Now, let me move to Mr. Mohammed Sassi. Mr. Sassi, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz saw crude plummet from $126 to $75 a barrel, offering a lifeline to the U.S. economy. But with Iran threatening to reimpose the blockade if the deal is violated, has the Global South finally realized that energy access is the ultimate weapon to counter Western diplomatic arrogance?
Well, to give you an introduction to your question, definitively the only deterrent that Iran possesses is the Strait of Hormuz. And what are the economical consequences of another closure of the Strait of Hormuz? And Iran, they are very aware of that. They have this critical thinking, and they know how America think, and of course the rest of the world regarding that point. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important maritime checkpoint. A renewed disruption has an immediate global consequences. And here I'm talking as an economist. You have the higher oil price. Yes, look, when they announced a few days back that, the negotiation, that the ceasefire is going to take place, even though it's not a ceasefire in my point of view, the MoU is just question of what can we do to find some common ground to begin to negotiate. And here, the point and the enormous distraction, as Yvonne was saying, as my predecessor was saying, is Israel. We are not talking about a war. A lot of people refer this as a war of Iran and America. Now it's Israel, Iran, and America. And to go back to the point that I was saying, you have the higher oil price, you have the natural gas price as well, and I can add the higher transportation insurance, the cost of shipping. As I said 3 months ago, the price now it was 45% more. Now is at today's date, I was checking 2 weeks ago, is 63%. And then when you know that how important is the Strait of Hormuz for the distribution of 1/3 of the resource of petrol for the rest of the world, Europe, Asia, etc. And then now the causality, the economical causality, the direct one, the Strait of Hormuz, a lot of people don't think that it is, but it is the inflation, of course. The pressure, the fuel cost will increase the inflation. The inflation is supposed to be at 2.3, now is at 4.2 in America, and is a direct link to what's going on in the mess around that part of the world. Now, the financial market, as you know, the financial market that doesn't have any heart, they don't have any emotion, is country risk. What is on the bottom line for me? What is my profit? Or what's going on now is something that is not going to be in favor of the economy in favor of the Marshall Farkas. Therefore, they are what they are doing. They are leading on investor toward safe having assets such as the gold or the US Treasury security. And again, this is very important for a country like China. China would like to have a change, but because of reserve also is a lot of US bond treasury or US how do you say, currency, they cannot move that fast. And finally, the last one, of course, the direct impact, the causality and the, how can I say, the outcome of it is a slower economic growth. Specifically when the energy and the country like Asia and Europe. We have to put all this in case. It's not because the Strait of Hormuz as a passage is the causality of all this. And now, as we are talking about with you the other day, it was the cause and effect on the chain. You have the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you have the reduction of supply, you have the higher energy cost, the inflation, and the market uncertainty. All of this, why? Because Israel is defying the international community. Israel, from day one, they knew that the ceasefire is not going to be in their favor. And they knew that, America as well and Iran, they link the Lebanon issue. And Israel, despite the ceasefire, they continue to bombard and kill innocent people. Now, my predecessor was saying that, America is not going to change. Yes, America, like Biden in 1972, as a young senator, when he was meeting with Golda Meir, he told her, if Israel didn't exist, I will invent Israel. I will be a Zionist. That's number one. You have, after that, you have all the president. But now, I think, and maybe I have a different approach of what my lecture of what Vance was saying. He was saying that, and he gave the number. He said 2/3 of the military budget in Israel is from America. And we want this ceasefire, and we told you, you have to get out of Lebanon. Now, I'm sure that behind the door, they are going to say, now they have a stick and they say, it's enough. Netanyahu, Trump told him 2 weeks ago, he was using the word that I cannot use here right now to tell him what the is doing. I want this to be done. He's still doing it. And furthermore, he's now defying Trump. And Trump didn't take it as lightly. He went back, he answered him, said, now you have to FFF, stop this. I want the ceasefire doing. The MOU, for me, again and again, is not inconsistent. I know the 60 days, yes, it's very important. But for a guy like Trump, I think you have to look at the mirror and say, what is in it for me? He doesn't care about Israel. He doesn't care about the GCC. He doesn't care about Iran. What he wants is say, I have to do something. And because the guy, he's a businessman, and he knows now the election is coming 60 days, very short period, close to the election. And his own base, the number is now, the last sondage that they have, 75% of Americans say we have to stop. This war is costing us, I think I don't have the number exactly, but it's since the beginning, something like $290 billion. And this is not going through. And economically, I hope I answer your question.
Perfect, Mr. Mohammed Sassi. Now let me bring Dr. Yvonne Ridley back. Dr. Yvonne, when it comes to legitimacy, the U.S. insists always on the rules-based order when discussing adversaries, that is, but acts as a shield for Israeli aggression, like we saw in Gaza and what we're seeing actually in Lebanon at the UN and in bilateral treaties. Now, how is this double standard radicalizing public opinion in Europe and the global South in general against Western political elites, according to you?
Well, the United States loves to talk about rules-based order, but they only apply those rules to their enemies. When their allies break the rules, the US protects them at the United Nations, the very heart of where we are looking for justice. And of course, we're not getting any. This double standard is making people furious, not just politicians and UN workers, but ordinary people around the world who can see quite clearly that Europe and the global South just don't matter. Audiences everywhere see through the game. The rules are just a PR shield for Western power. And it is radicalizing public opinion because people are simply tired of the double standards and hypocrisy at play.
Amazing. And if you come to look at the proposals that this deal has brought, to Iran, how would you analyze it? How would you think of it? I mean, a lot of people are saying it's kind of a copy-paste of what Obama actually offered before him.
Well, the Iranians are very astute, and when they signed this deal, as similar as it looks to the Obama deal, they probably realized that Israel would deliberately continue bombing in Lebanon. And of course, Iran is the only country in the world at the moment that's prepared to stand up for the Lebanese people. People keep talking about Hezbollah, but I would remind them that Hezbollah are all Lebanese-born people as well, which is something that the West wants to ignore. So I think that Iran knew fine well that this memorandum of understanding wasn't worth the paper that it was written on, but I think they just decided, let's go ahead. We're on a win-win situation because Israel will break the ceasefire in Lebanon just like it's done every single day in Gaza. And, this is a country that just can't help itself when it comes to breaking the law. Now, how America deals with that is up to the Americans. But as you, or as was pointed out just a few minutes earlier, there's an election coming up in America, and Trump will be mindful of that. And at the moment, Israel has put him between a rock and a hard place because increasingly Israel and America are looking like the bad guys, where Iran is looking like the upholder of international law, the respecter of international treaties, and, their word is good. The same cannot be said for America or Israel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Yvonne. And now back to you, Ms. Angha. The U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance postponed his trip to the Bergenstock talks, leaving diplomats to hash out the technicalities. Now, given the internal divisions in D.C., Ms. Angha, the internal divisions in DC and the powerful pro-Israel lobby, does the U.S. negotiating team actually have the political capital to deliver on the huge sum of $300 billion reconstruction fund and permanent sanctions relief?
Look, the team should be able to deliver some set of interim waivers, access to frozen assets. I think in terms of permanent sanctions relief and a real durable $300 billion economic reconstruction front goes beyond the control of the executive branch. Congress and just overall legal risk will be the bottlenecks going forward. But they do have enough political capital as sort of these lead negotiators to promise an interim economic opening. But again, it's not enough to guarantee a durable economic settlement on their own that the Iranians are seeking. The text of the Memorandum of Understanding says that the United States will work with regional partners on a plan of around $300 billion for Iran's reconstruction and development. And that mechanism will need to be finalized in the final deal. But, we've seen essentially some of the conversations where the vehicle that's being structured is like a private investments fund. So, essentially there wouldn't be any direct U.S. taxpayer money or grants that would be going through this fund. And there's been, encouragement and commitments coming, trying to request that the Gulf, Asia, South America, African countries sort of donating to this private investment fund. And that matters because it then means that the administration is trying to essentially design something that avoids a lot of the political, components of a direct congressional appropriation request. Obviously, that this makes it politically fragile. It's very obvious. But President Trump has publicly denied that the deal includes this $300 billion fund, even though the text that was transmitted to Congress clearly indicates this pledge in the plan. So a lot of that contradiction, the rhetoric, the messaging really does matter because, more than anything, you can see that this is a radioactive issue, domestically in the United States, this idea that the U.S. will be spending more money on essentially this sort of war. I think the sanctions question is obviously a lot harder. Under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act that was implemented during President Obama's administration, essentially says that the president must transmit any nuclear agreement with Iran to Congress within 5 days of that agreement. And during that time, the Congress is allowed to review. It's their review period. The president cannot waive at that time or provide any statutory sanctions relief under that agreement. So there's going to be quite a bit of sequencing and timing that's going to come into play, as this, MOU starts turning into a peace deal conversation and what that essentially entails in terms of sanctions relief.
Mm-hmm. So, Ms. Angha, you think that perhaps a partial sanctions relief is going to cut it here? Especially when we have this major domestic political flashpoint in the United States regarding who pays the $300 billion US dollars. As you mentioned yourself, President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have explicitly said that no single cent of American taxpayer money will go toward this fund. And as you mentioned yourself, that the administration suggested that the money will instead come from Persian Gulf states and other international investors looking to economically integrate Iran for long-term stability. But the issue is that we don't have any country that have yet confirmed any financial commitments to this plan. So do you think that a partial sanctions relief is going to cut it? And what about this reconstruction commitment and all the talk we heard about?
I think in terms of the sort of the interim sanctions waivers, the interim potential access to frozen assets, I think that essentially helps in, again, where we are in the interim solution. We don't have a peace deal. We're in the MOU, sort of the sort of preamble, let's say, of these conversations. I think that could be helpful to show a U.S. commitment. Again, Iran has been in these negotiations and the conversations with the United States before, so we'll have to see how that essentially plays out. For the reconstruction fund is, I think, a bit of a separate topic, and that essentially is going to really rely on how the administration engages with, other foreign governments, regional governments, private investors, and that's going to be a separate sort of track that I think there will be quite a bit of diplomatic engagement and conversations to rally support around this fund. But again, there's been the messaging coming out of the administration that there's no intention of having any direct U.S. taxpayer of money or grants going towards this.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Now, back to you, Dr. Kavanagh. If we come to look at who mediated this memorandum of understanding, we see Pakistan and Qatar coming to the surface, who succeeded in brokering this memorandum of understanding, where Western capitals actually completely failed. So what does this pivot say about the changing architecture of global diplomacy, and why is the U.S. increasingly forced to rely on non-Western powers to extricate itself from its own foreign policy traps? Dr. Kavanagh?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just say something quickly about the previous point, because people talking about the coming midterm election and what that portends for Trump, et cetera, et cetera. You got to realize the Democratic Party is going to run against Trump for being soft on Iran. The leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate has said, if Trump gets money for Iran, it's going to be with Republican votes only. So this is again, as your previous guest said, the sanctions relief requires the Congress to go along with it. And the Democrats, as much as there's going to be splits in the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party leadership and the majority of the Democrats are going to resist any sanctions relief from Iran on the basis of their commitment to Israel, because Israel does not want Iran to become a normal country with normal economic relations. Let me just make that point. Secondly, so the question, it's a very good question about the role of Pakistan and Qatar being the diplomatic mediators in this situation. As I said before, one of the things that has changed in the world right now and in the Middle East is that the United States no longer can presume itself to be in charge of the diplomacy, okay? And other countries that have enough influence and power are going to have to step in. Any agreement that's going to be reached is going to have to be brokered by someone and enforced by someone. And it can't be the UN, because the UN, the Americans have the veto in the UN. So you have to have some parties that you trust, that everybody trusts and relies on. And there are other countries who have stepped in. Pakistan has done that. Qatar has done that. And you other countries that could put themselves in that position, especially Russia and China and or Turkey, for example, et cetera. But this is, again, the end of the American assumption that it runs the world. It runs the world diplomatically, it runs the world militarily. And it can't, it not only, does it not? It can't run the world diplomatically. Nobody trusts it. They've realized. Mark Carney, the premier of Canada, got up and said this whole rules-based order thing was hypocritical and phony, and we never paid any attention to it. It was only for the other people. It was, we make the rules and you follow the orders. You follow our orders. So everybody realizes the United States cannot be trusted and will not be trusted again. And they don't have the power to enforce people to trust them. So we are seeing the emergence. It's very fragile, and we don't know where it's going to end up, of new countries and new powers that are going to have to step in and be the diplomatic mediators and the agreed enforcers of diplomatic agreements, et cetera. And we're at the very early stages of that, but that's an inflection point in the world geopolitical world also.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kavanagh. Now, Mr. Mohammed Sassi, back to economy. Iran's Revolutionary Guards made it quite clear that the Strait of Hormuz is only open for now, with 20 million barrels of crude already shipped out of Shibahar, who actually holds the leverage here. Is Washington actually being held hostage by its own market vulnerabilities? How would you analyze this?
Well, it's a difficult question that you are posing there, but I will try to answer it the best I can. If you mean the vulnerability of the US stock market itself, then yes, indeed, that can become a major issue, independently of the direct economy damage. You have here the mechanism that will include the investor psychology. Is very important. The financial market, as I said before, react to uncertainty before the real economy does. And that you have to take it in consideration. The threat, for example, to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz can trigger a sell-off. How can I say that? Trigger a sell-off because investors anticipate higher inflation, slower growth, like I was doing before in my intervention before, and of course the lower corporate profit, which is the main thing for any corporate in the world, but specifically in America. The oil price, of course, we cannot ignore it, even though, as I said many times, America doesn't import oil. America export oil. But because of the market, because of the financial market, this can be, if you have a spike in the oil price due to the Strait of Hormuz and all this chaos that you have over there, the transportation, the manufacturing, the airlines, which is sometimes you forget to include, that all this higher cost, they are a sector that they can begin to wait on the US corporate earning. And of course, then you are going to have the valuation of the US market is relatively highly valued during geopolitical shock. Expensive market can be more sensitive to the change in investor sentiment, which I was talking about the psychological effect. And then of course, the last one, but not the least one, is the financial contagion. We have a large decline in US market because they cannot tighten the financial condition. And you have, of course, basically with Trump, with this, if you have the tariff that he's trying to impose, and finally, what does it do? It reduces the consumer and business confidence and amplify the economical weakness, even if the US economy is less dependent on the Gulf oil than it was a decade ago. And again, all this, you cannot ignore the fact that the US economy has become less directly vulnerable, but also you cannot ignore the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz because it produces much of, as I said, the oil that pass through the Strait of Hormuz for other economy like Asia, Africa, and Europe. And the bigger vulnerability, as I said, it comes from the financial market and, of course, the causality in the inflation. And that, the scenario, you cannot, ignore it. The short term, the long term, and based on the MoU that you have, the statement of US official, now, like all my predecessor was saying, question of trust is not there. Question of morality is not there. And again, somebody was talking, if I can, a word about the 300 billion. A lot of people, think the 300 billion is coming from the state. No, it's going from the partner. The 300 billion is going to come from the Gulf region partner like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And you have the private investor and international financial institution that are going to be. But again and again, all this depend on all the countries and where we are going from here. And I think that, the 300 billion is going to be a tough task to come to fruition. And let's hope for the best.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Sassi. And since you talked about morality in your intervention there, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, there is a glaring contrast between the urgency the West shows to secure cheap oil and the apathy it demonstrates toward the civilian death toll in Lebanon and Palestine, for that matter. So, from where you're standing, how would you explain to an international audience that Western governments value the transit of supertankers over human lives? Dr. Yvonne Ridley, you with me?
Yes. Sadly, the West does care more about oil than lives. The Gulf states and Western capitals are simply terrified of a frozen economy. It is quite a brutal maths that this is happening to Western governments. Civilian deaths are a tragedy, but happening far away from them. But closing the shipping lanes is an economic emergency. They want cheap oil to keep flowing, even if it means that blood is flowing somewhere else. They preach about human rights in the morning and protect the supertankers in the afternoon. For the Western elites, I'm afraid that profit always comes before people. And that's why the West cares more about oil than lives, which might be quite a cynical outlook, but it's true. They want the cheap oil to keep flowing. Look what happened today. A record 55 massive commercial ships managed to sneak out of the Strait of Hormuz in what some refer to as the Great Escape. The oil is flowing, and 3 huge Indian tankers safely cleared the danger zone with more than 1 million tons of crude. But wait, because the peace is already breaking. Just as the ships escaped, Iran threatened to slam the door shut again Tehran says Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon have completely violated the new Islamabad peace deal. Although it's not saying anything publicly, privately, Washington is furious. And the US military claims Iran is bluffing because they do not control the water. Well, I've got news for the guys in the Pentagon. Sorry, mate, but yes, they do. The real danger is that even if the politicians stop talking, the water is still a death trap filled with 80 to 100 sea mines. And the bottom line is simple. The West got its oil today, but tomorrow the entire deal could blow up. And the way that Israel is running fast and loose with the terms of the ceasefire, that is very, very likely.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the terms of the ceasefire, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, I don't know if you noticed, but what happens to Iran's missiles and regional, allies when we speak about the Houthis, Hezbollah, etc.? I mean, haven't you noticed that the agreement is conspicuously silent on the ballistic missile program? We even had Trump publicly saying or suggesting that Iran is entitled to a ballistic missile force proportional to its neighbors. What happened to that war objectives, when this mess all started?
Well, you've mentioned the Houthis there. They've been incredibly silent and absent from the political landscape because, as I said before, Iran is the only country that is willing to come to the aid of the Lebanese resistance fighters. And the Houthis have never been shy in coming forwards to a fight, but for some reason at the moment they are quiet now. Whether they're in some little paragraph in this memorandum of understanding, I'm not sure. But it is interesting that they do not feature on the landscape at all. But Iran has shown before that if you push it hard enough, it will respond, it will fight back, it will kick back. So those missiles that you were talking about will be fired off, and my guess is in the direction of Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm. So that's something that, of course, Israel is not going to appreciate. Now, Ms. Angha, let's play the devil's advocate here. Hardliners in the US argue that Trump capitulated, I'm saying, by unfreezing the assets and allowing Iranian oil to flow without dismantling Iran's nuclear program, nor the missile program for that matter. So is the US effectively conceding that it fought a lost war for Israel's interest at the direct expense of its own national security?
Look, I think right now the United States, this current administration, is not necessarily formally admitting it fought a lost war for Israel. It's just plainly acknowledging that the war didn't necessarily produce those maximalist goals that were publicly advertised by the administration. I think the text of the MOU shows that all of those hard issues were deferred, right? The final disposition of highly enriched uranium, the terms of the enrichment, the sequencing of sanctions termination, the architecture of a longer-term verification of the nuclear file, all of that has been deferred to a later time. And all of the interim benefits that are on the table are these oil export waivers, access to frozen assets, a pathway to economic relief, an end to the naval blockade. And this is why you have critics saying that Tehran got more upfront than Washington did. But at the same time, describing this only as a surrender, and this is the other half of the story. I think, there's been, a lot of reporting by regional analysts that said the war was essentially badly disrupted the energy markets, and that really strained U.S. resources, obviously rattled Gulf states, and left, essentially the Iranian regime politically intact, and all of those consequences. So the regional balance of power emerged where there was this sort of, the Iranian government coming out battered, but essentially standing, as some reporting have described this, and so maybe the better formulation is that the U.S. isn't necessarily celebrating defeat right now, but it is trying to convert a very unsatisfactory military outcome into some sort of livable diplomatic exit before the economic cost becomes too high and rises. And so I would say, there is a real U.S. national security risk if this agreement essentially becomes an instrument for strength. Washington has pose, and what this actually means in terms of sanctions relief, and whether that sanctions relief means investment for the IRGC, who could theoretically become the biggest beneficiaries of any sort of fund or sanctions relief. So I think those are a lot of those components. So I wouldn't simply maybe call this as a simple capitulation, but it could be sort of understood as some form of recognition that coercion has its limits, and that the United States essentially at this point in time needed that diplomatic off-ramp.
But Ms. Angha, what does Iran give up regarding nuclear weapons and the missile program weapon? I mean, if you come to look at it, the critics are pointing out that this memorandum of understanding really resembles the 2015 Obama-Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA.
Look, I think the reality is all of these sticky, hard questions have been deferred. I think, essentially the win is, we could see this as fighting having stopped, and, the Strait of Hormuz hopefully being fully open and functional. And I would say maybe that would be the win that we can consider. But the entire nuclear file conversation is obviously very technical and requires quite a bit of technical details and discussions amongst experts. But there's a lot still on the table that's very unclear. The sequencing is very unclear, where a lot of, let's say will the material stay in Iran? Will it get downblended in Iran? Will it leave Iran? I mean, there's so many different components to this. And I think that's the part that's still very unclear. Will we get to that sort of part of the 60-day? We're still in this sort of interim arrangement that seems to be on and off again over the last few days. So again, that's a lot of the concerns is, what does this actually mean? What are the details? But I think comparing it to the Obama deal is a bit complicated, since that was a completely different era, very different time. Iran had very different capacities. So we're in a new era.
Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Kavanagh, back to you. We're seeing a large and profound rejection of U.S. dictates by the Global South. So if this 60-day ceasefire collapses due to Israeli violations, will we see an accelerated push by BRICS nations and regional powers to establish security and financial frameworks entirely independent of Washington?
Well, I think we're going to see that whatever happens to this MOU. I mean, that's got to happen, and it is happening in the world. There's a lot of trade now being done outside the dollar system, especially with China and Russia. And India, these are big economies that are doing a lot of trading outside the dollar system. And that's going to increase. There's no question about it. Everybody understands it. And Donald Trump himself said, one of the reasons we have to, give their frozen assets back to them, because it's going to imperil, people are going to run from the dollar system if we just keep grabbing people's money, grabbing, a sovereign nation's money, because we don't like their political stances. All right. So this is something that has been, as I think Michael Hudson said, back in Trump's first term, when he was doing this with Venezuela, Donald Trump is helping to destroy the capitalist system more than any of the leftists in the world. You are, and destroy at least America's hegemony, the dollar hegemony. By doing this, everybody in the world understands if if we stay within the dollar system, the United States can and will take our money if they don't like us for whatever reason. And this is exactly what the resistance is about Iran. Again, if Iran becomes a normal country with normal trade and economic relations with the rest of the world, it's going to become and is immune from further attack. It's clear that nobody's going to try and overthrow the regime again. Then Iran is going to become the dominant political and economic power in the Middle East. And Israel knows this. And Israel does not want to allow that to happen, and will use every weapon at its disposal to try and prevent it from happening. And the United States is kind of, well, we don't really, but why? Maybe Iran should have ballistic missiles. Why not? Maybe Iran should be able to have. Now they're saying this. Maybe Iran should be able to, have peaceful nuclear energy, electrical nuclear. That's overturning 40 years of consensus politics about Iran in the United States, based on the Zionist premise that we got to get rid of Iran as a coherent state. Exactly what J.D. Vance said. What the Israelis want is to turn Iran into a Libya with 90 billion people, a chaotic rogue state. And Israel is not going to be satisfied until that happens. And the United States is going to have to decide whether it's going to go along. Israel's going to do everything it can to get the United States back into that fight. And Iran is going to have to decide whether it's going to fight to prevent that from happening. It's going to have to make a decision in the next few days, whether it's going to respond militarily to Israel's actions in Lebanon or not. And so this is far from over. If you want to know what Donald Trump thinks, wait a minute, because he's gone from we're going to give him, it was going to be the $300 million thing. We're going to do away with sanctions, but to Iran's not going to get 10 cents. He did that in the space of a day, and he can do it in the space of turn it 180 degrees back in the space of a day. So you've got an totally incomprehensible leader in Iran, in Trump, but the antagonists here are Iran and Israel. And the United States has to decide where it's going to go with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kavanagh. And as a last question, but briefly, Mr. Mohammed Sassi, as we are coming to the end, the U.S. Economic blockade has historically been its weapon of choice. Yet the inclusion of a $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran suggests a massive concession, according to critics. So have U.S. sanctions ultimately backfired by forcing targeted nations to build resilient parallel economies?
Yes, I will try to answer what you are asking, but in fact, it's two separate questions. The first one, the 300 million, the reconstruction fund I was saying before, is not a direct U.S. government payment to Iran, rather is a private sector investment fund. And how can this sanction backfire by encouraging targeted country to build parallel economy? On one hand, you want to help the GCC to protect them, which we didn't do, and then they are bombing by Iran, and the sanction for Iran didn't work for the last 40 years. They find other channels. And you saw that not only with Iran or other countries, like, for example, Russia. As I said, Iran developed a sanction evasion network. Russia increasing use of non-dollar trade, and Venezuela, North Korea adapting through informal illicit trade network, even with what happened to the Venezuela a few months ago. So therefore, the resilience does not necessarily, to answer a question, means sanction. They have felt bad. Generally, that sanction often reduce the economic growth, foreign investment, and access to technology. But in the short term, in the medium term, they find substantial economy, they find other way to go through that. And on the longer term, they can also incentive the creation of alternative financial trade system. And you know that China take over, and you offer them this sanction from America, offer the opportunity to China to come with a golden plate and take all the goods. That's my short answer. If you want, I can elaborate.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed Sassi. But unfortunately, we have run out of time, and we have to leave it there. I want to extend my deepest thanks to Dr. Yvonne Ridley, Ms.
Good luck, Yvonne, for the food.
Angha, Dr. James Kavanagh, and Mr. Mohammed Sassi for all your invaluable insights today. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding represents a critical yet highly fragile pivot in Middle Eastern geopolitics. While the resumption of oil exports has provided temporary relief to global markets, the ongoing violations in Lebanon and the deep-seated hypocrisy within the international system threaten to ignite a much larger multipolar conflict. We will continue to monitor the talks in Switzerland and the reality on the ground with our panel of experts. Thank you for tuning in, dear viewers, and until next time, have a good one.